Welcome. Welcome back. We are now going right through. We've covered the prokaryotes, and those are the bacteria and the archaea. Then we've done the eukaryotes, and we've done protists, which are usually unicellular, but they also have the algae. And then now we're going, and we've also covered fungi, and now we're going to do plants and animals. And plants, we're going to have 2 PowerPoint slides dedicated to plants, but they should be pretty quick. None of these ones are too long. So let me share my screen. Come on, baby. Oh, come on, baby. Where are you? There we go. All right, so this is chapters 28 and 31, and we're talking about land plant classifications. Mr. Anderson has a great movie on these. All right, so again, we've covered bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Those are the 3 domains. And now we're going kind of deeper in, and we've talked about bacteria and archaea, protists and plant and fungi, and now we're going to be talking about plants. All right. So how did plants evolve? And that's going to be a main part of these slides, are how plants evolved. All right. So we now know that algae are the ancestors to land plants. And then you guys are going to be responsible for 1, 2, 3, 4 different kinds of plants, and kind of how they and how they evolved from algae to kind of get more and more complex. So if we look at green algae versus land plants, there's some very important similarities and some very important differences. So first off, algae, it is supported by the water around it, whereas plants, they have stems and leaves and cuticles that kind of all help that plant live in a terrestrial environment, right? In algae, the whole plant is photosynthetic, whereas in plants, it's really primarily the leaves that are photosynthetic, right? In algae, instead of roots, they have what is called a hold fast, kind of anchors the algae to the ground or to the bottom of the ocean. And in plants, obviously, we have roots. And those roots are not only anchoring, but they're really important for absorption of water and minerals as well. So the adaptations for land colonization, as plants kind of evolve from being algae, which is primarily in aquatic environments, to plants, which are primarily terrestrial. So there's a couple important adaptations. First, we have stomata, which you guys already know about, right? They're the little openings on the underside of leaves that exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen. Remember, plants take in carbon dioxide and they're going to release oxygen. They have a cuticle, which will prevent water loss. And that's why you see kind of water beating up on the leaves of plants, because of that waxy cuticle. They have lignin, which is the woody part of plants, right? The lignin provides mechanical support, and it strengthens and allows plants to kind of live on the terrestrial environment, despite environmental factors such as wind. And the reproduction in plants, we will see an evolutionary kind of process that involves more and more protection of the plant embryo, which is called the embryophyte. All right, we're going to see more and more as we get more the multicellular. As we get kind of more complex, we're going to see that this embryo is more and more dependent on its mother plant. All right, so the plants are multicellular photoautotrophs, and otherwise they go through photosynthesis. They're primarily terrestrial. They have tissue, right? They also have structures such as roots and leaves. Sometimes I call them the roots and the shoots. And the stems, obviously. They have sexual reproduction. Some organisms have very simple reproduction, and we're going to see that that gets very highly evolved as plants get more and more complex. And they have this very interesting kind of reproductive process called alternation of generations, where we are going to see kind of a situation where we go from haploid to diploid, and diploid to haploid as a plant goes through reproduction. So just to give you an idea of this alternation of generations, in plants, the haploid phase is called the gametophyte, right? Whenever you see this word phyte, that kind of should clue you in to being a plant, right? So haploid is the gametophyte, all right? And the diploid phase is called the sporophyte, all right? So if we start, for example, here in the diploid sporophyte, that is usually what we consider like the plant. The plant goes through meiosis to make spores, all right? So the sporophyte, conveniently named, makes spores. So we go from a diploid sporophyte, it goes through meiosis to make haploid spores, similar to our organism, to humans, right? Then those spores grow just through meiosis to make what's called a gametophyte. The gametophyte, guess what it does? It will make gametes, right? Those gametes can then fuse to make the sporophyte or the zygote, which will grow into a sporophyte, right? So for this haploid phase, we're going to see spores are going to grow into the gametophyte. They will make gametes. Those gametes will fuse into the zygote. The zygote will then grow into an embryo. And then that sporophyte will undergo meiosis to create haploid spores. And again, I'm not going to have you draw this out, but you do need to be able to look at a diagram and figure out what's going on. So the four main plant groups that you need to know. 1, bryophytes. Those are the mosses. 2, pterophytes, which are the ferns. 3, gymnosperms, which are like the conifers, like the pines and the one with pine needles. And then the 4 are the angiosperms, the flowering plants. And we'll go through each of these. Just to point out, of these 4 groups, the bryophytes, pterophytes, gymnosperms, and the angiosperms make up the large majority of plants, right? So most of the plants that you see out there with your eye are going to be angiosperms. They're the most successful of the plants. So starting at the very beginning, we have what are called bryophytes, right? These are the earliest evolved land plants. Remember, the ancestor was an algae, right? They have spores, just like fungi, those little units of unicellular tiny things that have the ability to produce a whole new organism. They have spores instead of seeds in the bryophytes. They have a flagellated sperm, which is shown here. You see these 2 kind of flagella, meaning that they are tied to water because the sperm has got to swim through water. They do not have any vascular tissue. And if you think of the vascular tissue in humans, we have veins and arteries, right? Plants, we're going to learn, have other kind of vasculature, which will help move things throughout its body. Bryophytes have no vascular tissue. They rely strictly on diffusion, meaning they can't be very big, right? They are dominated by the gametophyte. So they're primarily haploid. And they have the very start of these terrestrial roots, and those are called rhizoids, right? So if you look at a typical moss, which is shown here, the sporophyte is going to be here. All of this is the gametophyte, and we have the rhizoids down here. And some examples are here: hornworts, liverworts, and mosses are the most, the one that most people know about. So if you look again at the bryophyte, which are the mosses, we have here the sporophyte that is going to make your spores. Here, most of that green part of the moss is the gametophyte. What do the gametophyte makes? They will make the gametes, right? So if you look at the life cycle again, so we have this organism here. The sporophyte right here is going to produce spores through meiosis. Those spores each can make a gametophyte. That gametophyte will produce gametes, egg and sperm. So here's egg, here's the sperm. These flagellated sperm will have to go and swim until it finds an egg. Once it fertilizes, then it can grow the sporophyte. All right, the second group of plants is called the seedless vascular plants. These are called the pterophytes, and it's a silent P, pterophytes. And the general characteristics of here is that we are still dealing with spores. However, now we see the production of vascular tissue, all right? And these are the xylem and the phloem. So if we look at this, the xylem, notice it is one way. This is what's going to bring water and minerals up from the roots, all right? The phloem is two-way directional, and this is primarily food and water, and it can go in both directions. And the way I kind of remember that is flow down. So the water flows down. So I always remember phloem goes down and up, whereas xylem is only up. This is the first time we're going to see that woody lignin. And here, also the first time we see a sporophyte dominant plant. So it's primarily diploid here. It still has a flagellated sperm, so it is going to still be in pretty moist environments because that sperm has got to be able to swim. And we finally see real roots, right? So these are the ferns and their relatives, and you may have seen some of these like cattail-like things in the ferns. If you take a leaf of a fern and you turn it over, you will see these dark spots. Those are where the spores are made. And if you actually rub them, you'll get like kind of a reddish tan, like powder. Those are the spores. Those are baby organisms. All right, so if we look at the life cycle again, we are looking at a full sperm. That whole organism is the sporophyte. So again, that is a diploid plant, right? They go through meiosis to create spores. Those spores, sorry, what I'm trying, blue here is, so here, this is haploid, sorry. From meiosis, we're going to go from 2N, and when you make your spores, you're making 1N. Those grow into the gametophyte, right? And in a sperm, you make this kind of heart-shaped gametophyte where you make both sperm and egg on one gametophyte. They notice that the sperm doesn't have to swim very far then, right? So it goes and swims in, fertilizing, making our 2N zygote, which can then grow through this fiddlehead, making our new plant, right? So this plant then can then go through meiosis to make spores. Those spores can grow into the gametophyte, and along you go. And last year, my student sent me this amazing picture. So here is a fern gametophyte, and here's Lady Gaga. Notice they look similar. It's hilarious. All right. Third group of plants are the Gymnosperms. These it literally means naked sperm. Gymnosperm, naked sperm. These are the pines, right? And the cones, right? So these are the first time that instead of spores, we are getting seeds. We also see the evolution of pollen. And so pollen replaces the swimming flagellated sperm. So pollen really is plant sperm. So those of you that are maybe allergic to pollen, you're allergic to plant sperm. All right, we have a very developed vascular tissue. So again, those are the xylem, where water is moving up, and we have the phloem, where water and food can go in both directions. They have evolved to prevent water loss. A lot of that has to do with having pine needles, right? Not a lot of available water loss there. They are diploid dominant, right? So they are, the sporophyte is what you see. The plant out there is the sporophyte. And they have a very, very small microscopic gametophyte. So what you'll see as we kind of go through evolutionarily, the gametophyte gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The sporophyte gets larger and larger and larger. So the diploid gets more obvious, and that haploid gametophyte that makes the gametes is more reduced. So these are the conifers, and you'll notice that on one single plant, sometimes you get two different plants, one male, one female. Sometimes on one plant, you'll see both female and male cones. The male cones, you can kind of squish and you get pollen all over your hands. The female cones are those traditional like pine cones that you normally see. Ginkgo is another example of that. And we have these weird cycads too, which are pretty historic. And as you'll notice, these life cycles get more and more and more complex. So again, instead of going through all of this, I could ask you specific questions. For example, looking at this diagram, what is the structure that goes through meiosis, right? So you'll see here, we have pollen-bearing cones going through meiosis. Here, we also see the megasporangia, but if we follow that back, that's the female cone going through meiosis. The female and the male, the pollen, which is the male sperm, will interact with the female, and the female kind of part, I'm not speaking very well today, will interact with the female, kind of like the egg equivalent, and you will then get fertilization, right? And that's when we get our embryo. That embryo is really protected here, right? And then that can go get dispersed through wind or whatever, and you get a whole new tree that is developing. The fourth are these angiosperms, which literally means covered sperm. So the angiosperms, this is where you get a huge diversity in the numbers and distribution of plants across planet Earth. Most of the plants you see out in the world are going to be angiosperms. They're very successful. These guys are the only plants to have flowers and fruit. Anytime you see a flower or a fruit, that is going to be an angiosperm. These co-evolved with animal pollinators. They are diploid dominant. So when you see a plant that's an angiosperm, that's going to be a sporophyte. And the microscopic gametophyte is very reduced in size. All right. So these are all the ones you're familiar with. Even grass, palm trees, flowers, those are all angiosperms. And again, the life cycle is pretty complex. I remember doing a flower dissection at some point back in the day. And you can see that there are anthers that make pollen. The pollen will then go and sit on this kind of, I forget what it's called. What is that? The pollen tube. Pollen will grow, the pollen tube, the male will grow out and fertilize the egg. Then you get this zygote, which grows into an embryo, which is this sporophyte. Then the seeds, you usually have fruit. You can have a fruit that kind of grows around it and protects it. So fruit are ovaries. So in plants, pollen is sperm, fruit is the ovary. So just think about that next time you have an apple. All right, and so on. And again, I'm never going to have you draw any of this. This test, it's either going to be a quiz or it's going to be open note. So don't worry about memorizing all of this. All right, and we will stop there. I think the most important part, I'm going to just cruise on to the beginning. The most important part is this kind of phylogenetic tree situation that we're looking at, where we had a common ancestor being green algae, right? Then we saw that we had not worrying about that one. We had the bryophytes, right? Where mostly gametophyte, flagellated sperm, very close to water. Then we had we saw vascularization, xylem and phloem, still have a flagellated sperm, but the gametophyte is getting much more reduced. Then we get the gymnosperms, where we had cones and pine needles being kind of developed. And then eventually we had fruits and flowers with the angiosperms. All right, that is it for now. And please.